classical. Yes, Elodie Duyck. I work at NEOS. I'm a PhD student there with Femke de Jong, and I work more especially on freshwater export from the East Greenland Shelf towards the superland of Atlantic, like towards the seas of the superland of Atlantic, and the impact this could have. So I'm going to present the more recent work we did on the impact of wind on freshwater export at Cape Farewell. So first, rapidly, rapidly why we're interested into this. So the East Greenland Current is the main pathway for freshwater export from the Arctic and also from freshwater coming from Greenland runoff, and we expect these fluxes to increase with maybe impact on the stratification in the interior seas and with deep convection there. So, but yeah, the problem is we don't know that much on across shelf export. So even if you have a lot of fresh water which is accumulating over the shelf, if it doesn't get exported, we don't really know how much will get exported. So that's what I'm working on. And in order to look into that, we deployed drifters both in 2019 and 2020. And recently we published a paper with the results from the 2019 deployment. And what we saw there at Cape Farewell is that some of our floats got exported there, and it's all the shallowest floats, because we're using two types of floats: SVP drifters, which are anchored at 15 meters, and card drifters, which are much smaller and are anchored at 40 centimeters. So one hypothesis we did then is that maybe the reason why only card drifters were exported is because they are much more correlated to wind in this area, and that wind could therefore be a driving factor for export in the really really surface part of the water column. Moreover, in that area, so all over the shelf on the eastern shelf, you tend to have mostly northeasterly winds that tend to drive waters towards the coast. But then around Cape Farewell, you also find westerly winds, including a very strong westerly wind events in winter that are called T-jets. So yeah, we were wondering what could be the impact of wind on export there, and in order to look into that, we're using results from a high resolution model that from a simulation that has been run by Renske Rilderlos. So it's based on MIT GCM, and the simulation has a 2-kilometer resolution in its highest area, but we are mostly focusing on this area here. So there is up to 4-kilometer resolution there. So yeah, the question we're asking ourselves with these results is whether we manage to find export events across of freshwater across the shelf break, and whether we can relate them with specific wind patterns. So in order to do that, we define a shelf break. So you can see here that is based on the 800-meter isobath that is smoothed, and then we look at the freshwater transport across that shelf break in the first 100 meters. And what you see in green here is the strongest export that we see. So we built a composite with this, and we looked at the current anomaly and also at the wind during this composite time. So yeah, the circulation anomaly is then the circulation at this composite times minus the mean, and it shows that it tends to be more offshore than normal circulation. And we also see that during these high composite events, we nearly only had westerly winds. So this is reinforced when you compare the theoretical Ekman transport, so computed from wind stress in the model, with the transport in the first 100 meters. So it's quite highly correlated. It seems to show that the transport in that first 100 meters layer is mostly linked to Ekman transport and therefore to wind. And if we look at freshwater transport, and we decompose it between what is due to variability in the velocity and what is due to variability in the salinity, we find also that it's mostly due to variability in the velocity, and salinity seems to like only influence it a little bit. So therefore, it does seem like freshwater export in that area could be linked to specific wind events there. In order to look more into that, we defined two types of wind events. So northeasterly winds and westerly winds. And when looking at composites of the circulation at the surface and 25 meters, so again, that's anomalies, so the composites minus the mean, we find that during westerly wind events, so as we saw before, the circulation tends to be more offshore, but also there is a really big difference between the surface and already 20 meters, which is not so deep. And most of the changes are visible at the surface. Then the other thing we're wondering is it really westerly winds that could drive such export, or is it more especially tip jets, so very strong westerly wind events? So here we're looking at the 5% strongest westerly wind events, and the scale is not the same. It's 3 times smaller. So in short, it's the transport towards the offshore transports is 3 times stronger, but it's also visible deeper. So here we also see it at 25 meters, for instance. And if we look at the time series, we see that like the 3 colors represent different type of winds. So in yellow, it's the westerlies, and the red ones are the tip jets. We see that both for the volume and the freshwater transport, it's strongest in winter, but also it's only in winter that we see it also 25 meters. If we look at summer, the transport at the surface and the 25 meters is not really comparable. So then this is a bit more preliminary. So the idea was to look at specific wind events. So for instance, this one on the 23rd of January, where we've got very strong freshwater transport and volume transport, both at the surface and also visible at 25 meters. So this is images of what's happening then. So we do see the strong winds there that seem to be associated with water that is brought further away from the coast, and actually kind of runs Cape Farewell, leaving something behind. But it also seems to be associated with some changes in the sea ice there. And then if we look, I wanted also to look at another one, which is in summer, where we see only the changes at the surface, not that much at 25 meters. And what we see is actually quite similar. We also see westerly wind event, and then the water which is a little bit brought out like offshore and leaving something behind. So what could be the difference if we look at sections there, at sections across the shelf? We actually see that in winter the freshwater layer is a bit deeper, maybe because it's more mixed there, and that could also play a role in having the export deeper in the water column. So very rapidly, the last thing we're trying to look at is the impact, because that was all for liquid freshwater, but what could be the impact on solid freshwater? So for instance, here I've represented export across the shelf break of ice, and we find one very strong event. So I've represented what we see at this time. And you see that the strong winds seem to bring the ice away from the shelf, but also to break it up a little bit, and that could maybe enhance the melting of the ice, which will leave some freshwater behind and closer. Even if it doesn't get exported, it will be closer to the shelf break. And if we look at the MODIS image at that time, we also see very clearly first the cloud that is kind of shaped by the tip jet, but also the ice that is brought further away and which is kind of breaked up. So that was a little bit it. And to summarize, what we see is that it seems that the wind can have an impact on the surface freshwater as it runs Cape Farewell. but also, but yeah, and that's mostly the strongest westerly winds that play a role. So maybe yeah, maybe TIFJs could have a role there, and that could also drive ice off the shelf. So now what we want to look at is yeah, other areas at the shelf, and be thinking about the role of katabatic winds near Semantic Trough, because there are also really strong winds, and there has been already a study by Marina Oltmans about the impact on yeah, like on the ice there. So that could be an interesting thing to look at. And then of course, where does the freshwater go if it gets out of the shelf break? Because it's not because it gets a little bit away from the shelf and crosses the shelf break that it does end up in the Immigrant Sea or the Diverted Sea. Maybe it goes back into over the shelf afterwards. Yeah, and also whether we can quantify how much freshwater could get away from the shelf. So yeah, this is all quite still a preliminary. So I would enjoy questions and suggestions on that work. Thanks for listening.
Nice talk, Elodie. Thank you. Any questions for Elodie?
Can I ask a quick one? Thank you, Elodie. That was a great talk. So I maybe you said this and I missed it. The drifter deployments, were you able to do them in a number of seasonal installments, or were they mostly from a summer deployment?
Yeah, they were all summer deployments. So there were two in 2019. One just upstream of Semantic Trough, and the other one near Fram Strait, which did not really work because it got caught up, like drifters got caught up by the ice. And then we did another one near Cape Farewell this summer.
Great. Yeah, it's hard to get up there and look, do seasonal deployments. Yeah.
Yeah, and also since a lot of drifters got lost there at Fram Strait, then we got a little bit unsure about trying to do things when there is some ice around.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions for Elodie? I do have a question. Have you looked at the integrated freshwater export over your time series for trying to estimate the total water, the volume of water exported at that point near Cape Farewell?
No, I only looked at like either the full time series or the mean on the time.
Okay, thanks.